Hi, everybody. Welcome again, once again, to Rabbi Winston Shiur, Redemption Thursdays. We're dealing with a different topic this week, dealing with grief. We normally discuss what's going on in the community and what's going on in the world. We're at war right now, and I guess that's where we're going to come to this topic. I'm wearing a necklace right now, which is a remembrance of the hostages. It's like a dog tag. People wear this necklace just to always remind themselves that we're living in our nice little warm homes, but these poor people are still being held captive. And we have to learn how to deal with this because it's sort of like a collective trauma going on here. And I think Rabbi Winston's going to address this. And he teaches many other topics, obviously. So check his both websites, sharnonproductions.org under his name, or 36.org, and subscribe to his Parsha sheets and his books and all his numerous teachings. Thank you for joining us tonight, Rabbi.
Thank you. It doesn't seem like an obvious topic. Actually, it does a period of times. It does teach us a lot, and it is something to understand and appreciate it because it helps us to deal with our own situations and help the comfort of going through difficult situations. Obviously, there's a certain amount of grief that's healthy and necessary, and it's part of life. That's what Hashem put into the world. But it's also important to realize that aside from limitations, it should be an unhealthy situation, and especially to hashgacha pratis and dealing with one's relationship with Kodesh Baruch Hu, because very often one of the most common responses to grief over time is anger towards God, frustration. Why is God doing this to me? Why do I have to go through this? He's not going through this. She's not going through this. There may have other things, but I'm suffering with this thing. So and why did I lose this thing? Why me? Why my family? Et cetera, et cetera. And now, with the war going on, you're constantly hearing news of terrible losses that come up. Young people, married, not married, and it's causing national grief as well. And it's very easy to get swallowed up in it, and we have to not let that happen, because that will interfere with our avodas Hashem. And part of avodas Hashem is being able to deal with it. Of Shiva, we have a full year of mourning. Baruch Hu not only acknowledges the human reality, but he even imposes it to some degree on us that you have to respond. And there are things to learn from Tanakh about this topic. There are several situations, several incidences where we could gain something and use it in this respect, and that's what we're going to try and do B'ezras Hashem tonight. So one of the first and most important examples of this, I mean, you can go back to Adam Arishon. He mourning the fact he had missed the whole point. He had made a mistake. He had eaten from the dust of a rye. He had done a sin, a mistake he could not reverse, no matter how much tshuva he did. He went from extremely high level to a much lower one, even as in hours, still very low for him. This is part of the problem that happened to Shmuel Melech. As long as Shmuel Melech was the king, even though he didn't want to be king in the beginning, and he was very modest and he did the job quite well in the beginning, but he made some mistakes. He made some serious mistakes that cost him the malchus, and he lost along the way a certain connection to Kodesh Baruch Hu that he had enjoyed until the point in time that maybe he didn't appreciate how unique it was, and maybe he did. But at some point in time, when it became clear that he's no longer going to be the king of the Jewish people, not his children after him, so then it was withdrawn from him, the special siyat d'shmaya, and that left him chasir, that left him missing, melancholy, to the point of almost losing his mind. He was trying to kill David HaMelech. He was acting very irregular until he died in battle. And that's a tremendous loss. In some respects, it's a harder loss to cope with than somebody in the family, God forbid, dying even prematurely, because that's internal and really his emotional status, his emotional well-being in the course of life. So Adam Arishon, on such a high level, which he was able to recall after the Chet, and then to go down to become physical. In the beginning, he was compared to the angels. The angels themselves thought he was God, and to lose that and become a mortal individual was such a tremendous downfall that he mourned. I mean, the loss that he probably wanted life was still worth living after that, and he had to cope with it, and he did as much as he possibly could. But perhaps the most obvious example of a loss that we're used to that addresses the issue of grief and shivan and all that is the loss of Sarah. One of the first cases we have. I mean, he's the Avos until that point in time. We don't really pay much attention to the families, even Noach's family and his wife. We don't hear much about the kids, not too much. And Noach even also. But Abraham, his life, the camera slows down, so to speak, focuses on him and his life. And in Parshas V'chayis, he comes to buy Machpelah in order to bury Sarah, and as the Torah says, livchosa, to cry for her, to mourn for her. And even though in the beginning he's dealing like as a businessman, he's like trying to buy the place, which happens a lot. Unfortunately, a lot of times people die without having purchased a place to be buried, and negotiations have to take place where they're trying to find a place to bury the person, which is even more intense in Yerushalayim because the halacha is, the minhag is to bury the person before nightfall. The same day that they die, they should be buried without pressure on. But this type of thing happens, and Abraham had to deal with it, and not just negotiate, but negotiate with some of the lowest people around. They were Canaanites. The Canaanites eventually are going to be thrown under the land because they're so spiritually low in the totem pole. And that's what he's doing with Ephron. And he has to bargain, but eventually, he buys the place and he buries Sarah and he has to mourn and the chosa. And we're told that if you look in the Sefer Torah, and you'll find in most Chamashim as well, that the chof in the word levchosa, right, lamed beis levchof vav taf hey, and the chof inside the word itself is smaller. And Rashi doesn't pick up on this. I think the Balaturi maybe does. But the Medrash says the reason why the chaf is smaller, always, whenever this type of thing happens in the Torah, there's a smaller letter. It's to tell you that something else is going on. It's a remez. It's a hint. Remember Pardes, Pshat, Remez, Drush, Sod? So this is called remez. It's a hint to a deeper explanation. And Chazal explained to us that the chaf is telling us that even though he mourned for Sarah, he didn't excessively mourn. That's what the small chaf, he mourned as was proper, but not more. Now, why would he do more? I mean, sometimes she was 127 years old. She did give birth to Yitzchak. She saw a fantastic miracle. So why would he be so devastated to actually excessively mourn for someone who's lived such a fulfilling life? So the Medrash says because how she died. When Avram was commanded in the previous parsha at the end of Parshas Vayera, right, the Akedah, Hashem tells Avram to bring Yitzchak up as an offering. Not to shech them, he just assumes that, but to bring him up as an offering. Clearly, Avraham didn't tell Sarah Menu, because if she had known, she might have gone along, and she wouldn't. The story that unfolded would not have unfolded. So what happened was basically he took him up quietly, with Eliezer and Yishmael. They went together, the four of them, to the land, to the place that Hashem showed them, which ended up being Har Moriah, the land of Moriah, Har Moriah, the Temple Mount in Yerushalayim, where the base of Mikdash later be. And Avram was all set up. He left behind Yishmael and Eliezer with the donkey, and he went further up the mountain because only Yitzchak was meant to go with him, and he bound him, hence Akedah. And they're all prepared to go through with the Akedah. Avram is, as heavy a heart as he had, because don't forget that Yitzchak was supposed to be his progeny. He was supposed to be the hemshech of all the avodah he had done. He was supposed to be the continuation of Abraham's spiritual legacy of showing the world who God was and to promote that more. And now he's dying without any children. He didn't get married yet, 37 years of age, but he's not married yet. And now he's going to die. And what happened to that dream? But Abraham is commanded, it's a test. It's the 10th and final test of Abraham Avinu, and he knows that. And so he goes along and does everything he's supposed to do. And then, of course, Kush Baruch Hu stays his hand at the end. He says, don't do it. And he says, but you told me to. He says, no, I never told you to shech him. I told you to bring him up. Now bring him back down again. So no contradiction. But Avram made an assumption that that's what it meant. That's usually what it means. Bring him up as a sacrifice usually means to shech them also. But that wasn't the case here. And he's supposed to bring him back down. And you can imagine that the jubilation, that Avram must have felt that I passed the test. and I didn't have to kill my son. Now he's going to live. He's going to get married. He's going to have Yaakov Avinu and the Shvatim, and so it all worked out fantastic. I cannot wait to go home and tell my wife what just happened. And he goes home, and this is long before social media, even newspapers probably, right? And he goes home and he finds out that his beloved Sarah is no longer. She's not alive. She's dead. And how did she die? Well, it's tied to the Akedah. It says that Og, the giant, came. He wanted if he couldn't have Sarah for himself, he wanted that she should suffer the consequences of the Akedah. And he says, you know where your husband's gone right now? No, he just wanted a mission with my son. Well, he went to do the Akedah. God commanded him, and he went to take Yitzchak up as an offering. And apparently, even though it was very far away, because she was down in Beersheba, and he was all the way back up in Yerushalayim, but somehow miraculously he was able to hold her up in the air, and she could see Avram about the Shecht Yitzchak at the crucial moment. And there's two opinions as to why she died. One opinion is that the fact that she was going to lose Yitzchak, and it came as a shock to her that she had to die, right? That it caused her to die. And the other opinion is that she was worried that he wouldn't go through with it and failed the test, as much as she had yearned and lived for Yitzchak to be born to her. Was her whole life. And she had a very close kesher. We see from Parshas Chayesara that she was very close to her son too. She loved him to pieces. But still, if God says she was devoted to Hashem, if God says do what you have to do, what's the point of denying God the gift that he gave to you? He can take it on his own. He doesn't need you. Here's the opportunity to participate in whatever history is throwing at you right now. But otherwise, Hashem does it on his own. So that may have been the reason why she died instead. Either way, she died because of the Akedah, whatever the opinion is. And Abraham, of course, how do you feel? You do the Akedah, even though God commanded it, and you're doing everything right. You can't help but feel like what have I done? What have I caused? Well, obviously it's major Shkacha Pratis, and Abraham Avinu had to deal with it, and that's why Livchosa, even though it was all so difficult and seemingly so negative, Abraham kept it all in perspective. That's the way he grieves. He mourned for her. He was going to miss her. He lost her. He was hoping to share many more years together with her. It didn't happen. Now he had to mourn the fact that she was gone, and livchos, the small little chof, which by Hanukkah time we spoke about, and its symbolism in terms of one's reading of divine providence, that he did it in the proper proportions. And it's interesting because if you look in the a lot of Sidurim, for Hilchos Avelis, which they have in most Sidurim, you'll find that it's called Hilchos Smechot. That's another name for the laws of Avelis, laws of mourning. Hilchos Smechot, which literally means the laws of joyous occasions, right? Smechot normally say to someone in a positive sense, you're saying goodbye to somebody, especially after nice occasions, spending time together. You should only shoot them on Smechot, on happy occasions. So why is mourning called Smechot? Well, we have this idea of when something is a negative thing, rather than address it directly, we put a nice spin on it. So rather than call it Hilchos Avelos, which is what it's called in the Shulchan Aruch, right? We call it Hilchos Smechot, as if to say we should only know happy times rather than negative times. But like everything else in Yiddishkeit, there's Pshat, Remez, Drush, and so on. There's a deeper explanation, But how do you go from mourning to Smechot? How do you go from such a level like that? So that's what Abraham is conveying to us if you understand what's actually going on. But the best place where this shows up, well, actually the second best place. The best place is the last one. There's quite a few, but we're only like 3 right now today, Hashem. And the second one is, of course, in Parshas Shmini, Sefer V'Yikra. It's again a very, very happy time. The Jewish people have just completed the construction of the Mishkan, which in itself is a huge feat, because we're not talking about building a big shul, right? A big shul just requires an architect, an engineer, structural engineer, all the permits, whatever. But it's just a physical building. hopefully God will be there in some form or another, but not like he was in the Mishkan. We're not building a microcosm of Maisa Bereshis. We're building a shul to pray, to daven in. It's holy, it's important, 100%. It's got a certain halachas about it. It's not Beis Hamikdash, even though it's called a Beis Hamikdash mi'at, a small Beis Hamikdash is not really that close to that. And that's why the rules are a lot different in terms of how you act in the Beit Knesset versus the Mishkan itself. And they succeeded. Not only did they build the Mishkan as per divine specification, which was incredibly intense, it required Siyata D'Shmai, required Ruach HaKodesh, as everyone who participated, they received it to do their work. And now it's done, and Moshe assembles it. But the test, right, the telltale sign of the success is whether the actual divine presence of God comes down into it, as if it's the home for the Shekhinah, where the avodah is going to take place, and that's what happens. So, like they're literally in ecstasy, spiritual ecstasy, watching this take place. That the Shekhinah is going into the Mishkan that they built, and they're completely joyous to the point that Nadav and Avihu, the two oldest sons of Aaron Cohen, lost it, but lost it in a good way, not a negative way. They were so euphoric, they were so driven to connect to Kodesh Baruch Hu, to get as much spiritual connection from the opportunity that they had before them while it was there, that they actually ended up bringing what's called an unauthorized offering, an Eish Zara, strange fire. And because they did that, it says that kind of like, bolts of fire, lightning, whatever, came up from the Aron HaKodesh and the Holy of Holies and went through their nose and burned their souls out from within them. Their bodies remained intact. They weren't burned at all, but they died. And again, from the highest of heights to the lowest of lows, that's a lot of the when people know that someone is dying, someone either God forbid is sick or they're old, and you can see that they're on their way out. It's a little bit easier to live with, to work with. It's still sad, it's still painful, still difficult to say goodbye to someone you love, but there's a certain preparatory process you're able to go through and to process what's happening because you have the time to do it. It's when this shock of before this war began, many people who have died were people who probably for the next year or two would have gone to shidduchim to get married, and families were looking forward to that, and had plans and dreams for these children. And all of a sudden, this war breaks out, and boom, everything changes, just like that. And it's like from the heights to the lowest of lows. Painful and very, very hard to adjust to. And Aaron HaKohen, who's still feeling guilty about the Egel Zahav, the golden calf, he's still wondering whether or not God has completely forgiven him. And actually, this is the deaths of Nadav and Avihu and the other two sons. According to the Gemara, that really all four sons were supposed to die because of his participation, or at least his lack of stopping the golden calf. He didn't really participate in it. He really wanted to stop it. But because he didn't die instead, the Rizal explains, he was supposed to put, just like Hur died trying to stop them, that was supposed to be his thing as well, but it's a longer story. And Moshe davened, and instead only two were taken. And you have to understand how the whole thing works out. This with that, and this with this. It's like it's all that's the complication of a lot of Hashgacha Pratis. But the bottom line is they died in this process, and Aaron feels also responsible to, just like Avraham felt responsible to some degree. It's inevitable. When you're human, that's what's going to happen. And Aaron, for sure, because Avraham didn't do any chet. He didn't make a mistake. Didn't do any affair. He did everything that way supposed to be perfectly, and she still died. But here, Aaron also, by the way, he didn't think he was doing a chet. He if anything, Aaron was trying to do a huge mitzvah. In fact, he was sacrificing himself, even though he didn't physically die. He sacrificed himself spiritually because if they had killed him, killing Hur was murder, and that's terrible. But killing Aaron, he's the Kohen Gadol, and since Har Sinai, while the Shekhinah was still on it, had the halachic status of being like the Beis Hamikdash, and if anyone kills the Kohen in the Beis Hamikdash, there's no kapara for the generation, and Aaron knew this. So therefore, he was trying to put off being killed, not for his own sake, but for their sake. Nevertheless, God said that's not what was supposed to happen. So that was counted as a mistake, and the cost was going to be all 4 sons. Moshe definitely for all 4, but only 2 got saved, and not the Avihu died, died instead. But nevertheless, Moshe says, God told me, he told me that back in Parshas Tetzaveh, that in the future, on this day, that he will be sanctified through his holy ones. And I thought that was you and me, you and I, right? I thought that who's holier than you and I? That's what I was thinking to myself. But now I see Nadav and Avihu were on a higher level. And I once heard a shir what that actually means. It means that even though it was a chet, what they did, in principle, it was a great thing. Because prior to Mount Sinai, before the halachas about how to serve Hashem were handed down to the Jewish people, so then doing what they did would have been heroic, would have been absolutely fantastic. The inspiration, the drive they had, the she'ifa they had for Hashem to come close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with all their being was unparalleled. And Moshe said, if only we had that. And I see that they had that, but, and this is a very important but, once the Torah was given, once the halachas were given, we have gvulot, we have boundaries, we have guidelines we have to work within. Otherwise, the Torah falls apart, and the Jewish people fall apart. You see, take a look. Once those boundaries go, Jewish people just disappear. So they died also as an example of 2 things, and that is that even if you do have this fantastic drive to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you still have to do within the boundaries of halacha. And Moshe is consoling his brother, and because they're also Moshe's nephews who died, right? That they're great. They died, yes, but they died as great people, and that's supposed to be the consolation for Aaron Cohen. The Torah tells us in 2 words Aaron's reaction to the entire thing: Yidom Aharon, and Aaron remained quiet. Remained silent, didn't say anything. Now, the truth is, usually if you go to Asa Shiva, right, and you're consoling somebody by telling them about the one who was lost and how great they were and the wonderful things they did, the stories are fantastic. And it's just amazing, the stories that come up, usually sitting around, Shiva, and it's wonderful to hear, very inspiring, even if it's someone for many years, but you don't know everything about them. I remember, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg Tzal, he was Rosh Hashiva near Yisrael, and the brother of my Rosh Hashiva, Rav Noach Weinberg, and I knew Rav Yaakov somewhat. I'm pretty familiar with him. I spent some time with him. He used to come to Shator in the summer times and teach us, so I knew him a fair bit. And I admired him in terms of his he was very, very, how to describe it, but he was very dedicated, devoted, very straight, very, disciplined. To give an example, that he used to smoke 3 packs a day back in the 60s when people did it, and they were, the Surgeon General just come out with the warning that it's dangerous for your health. But it took many years, decades, before the rest of the world caught on, and even more time until the yeshiva world caught on. And I remember coming to Israel in the 1980s and going to the base medrash where smoking was still allowed at the time, and it was like a cloud. There was like a cloud in the middle of the base medrash hovering above from all the smoke that people were smoking, a lot of tension, And he used to smoke 3 packs a day, and his wife had seen already that it was dangerous for his health, and she asked him to stop. And I guess he tried me, whatever, but it didn't happen. Didn't happen right away. And so he was going for physical, and his wife knew this, and she called the doctor up and said to the doctor, my husband, if I say something, it's not necessarily going to become halacha, but if you tell him to stop smoking, that becomes halacha for him, and probably he'll stop. And the doctor did exactly that. He said, you really should stop stop smoking because it is dangerous for your health. And Rav Yaakov said to the doctor, I know my wife called you and told you to tell me that, but now that you said it, it's become halacha for me. And he literally stopped smoking on the spot. 3 packs a day to 0 packs a day. And he said it was a little difficult in the beginning, but it was halacha. And this is the type of Rabbi Yaakov. He was like a machine in some respects. He was very humble, very quiet about things, but he would show up in the morning, he would teach for an hour, and then another hour, another hour. He knew so much. He would walk to the front of the base measures. They would tell him on the way up what he was going to talk about, and he would talk for a whole hour saying and but and all those other things that people pause on to think. It just came out beautifully. One of the few people I could listen to say the same thing more than once, because it was always so enthralling. And that's the Rabbi Yaakov I knew. But after he passed away over 10 years ago, maybe 15 years at this point in time, and I listened to the Hespedim, and I read about Hespedim, about his, from back in Baltimore, the stories that came out of his chesed, the kindness is the thing, sacrificing a lot. Just one small example of how he had one heater back in the days when we didn't have central heating like we have today. We had one heater for his office to keep him warm. Otherwise, it was freezing, literally freezing. But there was a couple who were too poor to buy a heater, and he gave his heater away without telling the yeshiva or anybody, so they could be warm. He froze instead. But there are countless stories like this. And this is what happens at the house shiva. So usually, what happens when it happens is that the people who are being comfortable say yes, and they'll acknowledge and say something, and they'll come back with their own story and acknowledge the truth, or say it's wonderful. I've never heard that before. Not the Yadom. They don't remain silent. It's almost like, he's speechless, but not because he's being comforted, but because he's just shocked, doesn't know what to say. Like the brothers, after Yosef says, Ani Yosef. And if he's shocked, then that's not really dealing with the situation. That's not really teaching us anything about how to deal with terrible grief. We'll have to come back to that, B'ezras Hashem, because the answer to that really is in the third story. The third story, the classic case of somebody who suffered and had to and grieved terribly, is the story of Eov, otherwise known as Job, right? The famous Job. The story is a little unusual, hard to understand at first, but it does have a very clear explanation, as the Arizal explains to us in Parshas B'Shalach, and where he explains the whole episode. Maybe we'll get to it, B'ezras Hashem, but he's the man's a righteous person. He's a tzaddik. The Jewish people couldn't even conquer Israel, Eretz Canaan at the time, as long as he was alive, because his merit alone saved the Canaanites, even though they had terrible demerits to their own name. But he lived in Eretz Israel, and he was their protection, and he was kind. He was very successful. He was a successful person. He had money. He had a beautiful family, and the story goes that God and the Satan are talking to each other, and the Satan comes and says to Hashem, I've traveled the entire land and I found nobody like Avram Avinu. So God says, have you seen my Eov? And this is where we get the expression, Al tiftach pe Satan. Don't open your mouth to the Satan, because God did exactly that. And the Satan says, he's no big deal. And Hashem says, well, he's quite devoted to me, and he does everything he's supposed to do. And, he's a tzaddik. He's a very special person. Turns out, anyhow, by the way, that Eov is the Gilgul of Terach, which is Avram's father. Different story for them at the time. But God says he's righteous. And Satan says, no, it's only because he's been so successful. And he has so much going for him, so much in his life that he's able to enjoy. If he lost it, I don't think he'd be such a righteous person anymore. So God says, okay, let's test him. Let's see what happens. So he gives reshus to the Satan to go do almost his worst. And overnight, he not only loses his wealth, he loses his entire family, all of the kids, like one disaster after the other. They come and they tell him one bad news, but not just a little bit of bad news, terrible bad news, one after the other. You've lost all your money. You've lost all your children. You've lost, and he goes for, but he hangs in there. He hangs in there, a man of faith. He believes in God. Famous line, I came in this world with nothing. I'll leave this world with nothing. That's God's business. I had what I had. Now it's missing. Now it's gone. That's the way it goes. That's the Eov. So, okay, he proves his point. Now the Satan comes back and says, I've been traveling the land all over the place. There's nobody like your righteous Avraham. I did the Kedah and all the other tests. And God says, what are you talking about? You just saw it for yourself. You took away everything from Eov. You caused him terrible suffering. And he still is a Maimon. He still believes in me. He still has tremendous faith. And he says, yeah, but that's because I wasn't able to inflict any physical harm to him on his body at all. So God says, okay, you can do that. Just don't kill him. Don't take his soul. That much you can't do. But you can go ahead. So he gets terrible boils and his body. It's like as if it wasn't bad enough, but it's salt in the wound, injury to injury. Now Eve is being pushed to a point where it's. I mean, we were broke a long time ago. The bus comes 5 minutes too early and I miss it. I'm already wondering where God is when I need him. And Eve has gone down this terrible road, hanging in there. And the Gemara says he didn't even verbalize his complaint. It was only in his heart. Yet the Gemara says he wanted to turn the world upside down in his head because of the whole thing. Anyhow, as the story goes, once that happens, and the Satan kind of proved his point in a sense, God comes to Eve and he says, "What are you doing? What are you complaining about?" He says, "What am I complaining about? You know what happened to me." The Gemara has a whole dialogue that's very fascinating about what went on, what transpired, and the word Eov is actually the same word as the word Oyev, which means enemy. And Eov says to God, maybe you were looking me up in the phone book and you got the wrong one. You're looking up Oyev, you got the wrong one. You're looking for Oyev and you found Eov instead. And God says, I don't make mistakes like that. And he gives all kinds of examples of how precise he is, God, in running his world. So if he goes after Eov, it's no mistake, never a mistake, never an accident. Even though there's a couple Gemaras that kind of like go in that direction, but even they have to be understood within this context ultimately. And the Gemara does, move in that direction. But certainly when the Gemara is saying in Baba Basra that God says to Eov, and then in chapter 38, that's when it starts to open up. And it's actually incredible to read. Fantastic story. And it's one that whether a person's suffering or not suffering, they should make a point of learning backwards and forwards because it is such a fundamental work of Torah Hashkafa. And in Kabbalah, the verses are used constantly for deep Kabbalistic ideas. It's a very profound sefer. Some say Eov didn't exist. Some say he did exist. The ones say he didn't exist. But Moshe made him up just to make a point. But we seem to hold that he did. The Rizal for sure holds he exists because he talks about him as a real person. And the Gemara also seems to side like that as well. But God says to Eov after he corners him and says you're complaining. He says, "Where were you when I founded the earth?" Short pasuk, short sentence. That's what God. Where were you when I founded the earth? What does it mean? Well, the next few chapters are all about God, blowing his own horn, telling Eov about who he is and what he's capable of doing and how much he understands and how much he knows and how much control he has over everything and how he's able to do fantastically miraculous things. And you can just sort of feel Eov going, Eov was already small in his eyes, and certainly after what happened to him, even smaller, but he's just getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller as God goes on and on and on. And finally, Eov, at the end of all of it, chapters later, Eov says, I was wrong. Boy, did I miss it. I got lost. I kind of knew this all along, but I got lost in my sorrow. I got lost in all my difficulty. And I realize now who you are and what you do. And I'm good. I'm going on with this now. I'm gonna move on from what happened to me and just rebuild my life. And actually, because of that, God does in fact rebuild his life, giving him back everything that he had, even more so. And the Gemara goes on to Shevach that the story ends happily, which is not always the case in everyday life, but certainly in the story of Eov. But it's the middle part that really concerns us the most. And what did God mean by this? Where were you when I founded the earth? What does God mean by that? He means the following thing. He says, it's like in a sense, science and physicists, they've uncovered so much. They're brilliant people. They are who they are because they are so smart. And they talk about the universe as if that's all there is. Although they're being forced to consider more, something beyond the universe. Yes, now they have to do that because of what they discovered. But for the longest time, they've dealt with reality, including and especially the reality of God, based upon the universe that they're familiar with, or at least they think they're familiar with. And if you learn Kabbalah, so all of a sudden, the physical universe that we think is so vast and so amazing, so awesome, is really like a pinhead compared to all the different levels of reality that God created just to get to this world. Adam Kadmon, right? We have Atzilus, and we have Bria, and the Yetzirah, and the Father Yasir. The world, the universe that we live in is, the bottom two levels, basically. It's not the upper ones. The upper ones, and they get geometrically bigger as you go up. So our world is so small compared to the overall creation. And that's even before talking about Orein Sof, God's unlimited light, infinite light that goes everywhere in every direction equally forever. We don't even understand what that means. It's huge. If you could see it, you would think you don't even exist. You would wonder what's even looking, because it would feel so small. A friend of mine just came back from Arizona, and he said, he asked me, you ever been in the Grand Canyon? Well, I just saw it from an airplane looking down. I was never actually there myself. And it was quite spectacular from above. He says, no, but you got to see it. You got to be there with it. He's a from guy, right? You got to see it for yourself. He says, you feel like this. You feel like nothing. But it's not demoralizing. It lifts you. It's inspiring. You feel like you're part of something much bigger. And all of a sudden, whatever is bothering you disappears. Just like disappears, because this bigger reality all around you is so all-encompassing and so awesome. And these are just mountains and a canyon. That's all it is. I was in the Swiss Alps, right? And you get a similar feeling as well looking up at the mountains. Of the truth is, every day I come home, even this little community where I live, Baruch Hashem, it's like the view is absolutely fantastic. It's like you just see things, the way it's made, it's small, tiny, compared to anything else, but it's just every day for over 30 some odd years, I've never grown tired of the actual view. And there's times when the fog comes in and fills the valley and it looks like Switzerland from a small portion of it. We think we understand a lot more than we actually do. And believe it or not, so much of the suffering that we go through in life is because we're coming from our small little slice of time. Our small little slice of life. It's our whole world, our whole reality. We wake up in the morning, all we know is ourselves. We see other people, but how I feel, how I interact with reality. You're like a prop in my set. And that's true to some degree. We're all props in everyone else's set. But I'm the central focus. I wake up in the morning, I go take care of my needs, and I go about my day, but it's me the entire time. This is my whole world. The news, of course, expands your horizons to a large degree because it's opening you up to a larger world. And then you have telescopes and fantastic pictures to show us the edges of the universe. And again, but it's not so experiential. It's still very small, and most of it anyhow is detached from you. Like even though I live in Eretz Yisrael and I see what's going on in the rest of the country, the fact that it's not taking place in front of me detaches me from it to some degree. I have to make myself, feel and respond as if I'm a part of it too, even though it's taking place someplace else. That was the godless of Moshe Rabbeinu, part of the godless. He had so much other things to make him great. But even though he lived in the palace of the king and lived like a prince, he went out into the field to feel the burden of his brothers, to be a part of it, on whatever level he could. And that's what made him the great leader that he was. But we don't do this. We don't want to do this so much. We don't want to feel, sorry about things in life. We want to be happy all the time. We don't like pain. We avoid it as much as possible. And so then things happen to us. It's our world falling apart. And that creates a tremendous sense of grief. It's my loss. And it's a loss that I don't understand. It's a loss that's going to leave me lacking. And even though we hear things like time heals all wounds, and we know that after 12 months, we start to get used to things and we move on. Even people who are very close to their parents or siblings or spouses, whatever they can, people, they move on. They can't. Even if it's a tragedy, God forbid, it may not be exactly the same again, but they move on. They go on with life. And there's a way to be normal again after that. And that's what God told Eov. God told Eov, there's different ways to console somebody. But we say when we go to a house of Shiva, and we're leaving, we say Hamakim Yenachem Eschem. We use the term Hamakim. We don't say may God comfort you. We use the term Hamakim, the place. May the place comfort you. There's so many different names to use. You can use Havaya, not the way it's written, but we use it in Tefillah, but here we're saying Hamakim. Yenachem Eschem. Why? So the Nefesh HaChaim explains in Shar Gimel of Nefesh HaChaim that the name Hamakim means that God is not in creation, but creation is in God. There's a difference, right? It's like the Mishkan, for example, was a structure, and the Shekhinah came down into it. But it can separate once again, if it wants to. And it did, the temple, Beis HaMikdash also. But when everything's inside of Kadosh Baruch Hu, nothing can exist separate from him, which means that whatever's going on is him. He's doing it, he's feeling it, he's making it happen, he's you, and you're part of him. It's all one reality. Nachem Ish Gamzu. Remember Gamzu Tova? Nachem Ish Gamzu is called Nachem Ish Gamzu because he was the Ish who always said Gamzu Tova. This too is for the good. What did he mean by that? He meant that everything is within a Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's all part of God, and God can only do good. What about all the evil we see? It's a perception. And a lot of times the perception is based upon our own way of looking at reality. But Nachem, he understood, he trusted Kadosh Baruch Hu for the process. God says to Eov, and this is what Aaron understood, that when God does something dramatic like that, when something happens that to us seems absolutely tragic and terrible and something we have to mourn for, we do, 100%. But it's for the good. I know, it's just words. Anyone can say that, for sure. No, but it is. How can it possibly be for the good? How? So the Rizal says, right, if you look at the Shir Shel Yam, what the Jewish people say by the sea, right, they mention, Yimin Hashem Tir'atz Oyev. The right hand of HaKadosh Baruch Hu destroys the enemy. That's what he says. And the result, and there's nothing wrong with that verse. It makes sense the way it is. We don't need to elucidate it. The right hand of Hashem, God's power, his Gevurah, crushes the enemy, which is what he did right there by the sea with the Egyptians. But the result says, no, look at the letters, Tiratz Oyev, crushes the enemy. It's the same letters as the words Saras Eov, which means the leprosy of Eov. Okay, that's interesting and certainly kind of coincidental, but we don't believe in coincidence, but Ashkachadik, whatever, but what does it do with anything? So he said, well, let me tell you the story. What happened over here? You may recall that back in the beginning, that Paro wasn't sure what to do with the Jewish people. So you know what he did instead? He put together a little tribunal. He called together Eov, Yisro, and himself, and Bilam too. That was it. Paro was the outside. He was like the outside guy. The three were the based, so to speak. Okay, and he said to them, Jewish people are like a cancer. What do I do with them? And Bilam said, oh, just like every cancer, destroy it. Right? And we see what happens later on with him. And Yisro says, I want nothing to do with this. He runs away and merits to become the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu later on. Right? Eov pleads the fifth. Says nothing. According to the Gemara, he says, according to the Zohar, he says more, but according to the simple Pshat of the Gemara, he says nothing. He's quiet. He's the deciding vote. Bilam says destroy them. Yisro says don't. And Eov is the deciding vote. And what does he do? He stays quiet. 1 versus 1 with one that abstains. And as a result of that, so Paro acted upon his own desire, his own whim, and decided to destroy the Jewish people. And that's the way that story is right there. Then, much later on, 116 years later, after the slavery is all over, the Jewish people are leaving by the Yam Suf. What happens is that the Medrash says that the Jewish people were not really, clear of all their guilt from the idol worship they had practiced back in Egypt. So God was about to destroy the Egyptians by the sea and save the Jews. But the Midas Adin, the attribute of justice, says to God, that's not fair. Either destroy them both or save them both. But you can't, they're both guilty of the same thing. So but there's a difference between the two of them, because it says that the Jewish people did it because out of habit from living amongst Egyptians for so long. The Egyptians did it because they wanted to. It's a different level of rut and of will. But anyway, that's what it says. So what does God do? That's where the story of Eov begins. The Sitra Achra, who's the accuser, he's the one causing the problem. So God has to pull him away from the sea in order to save the Jewish people. So what does he do? He uses Eov as a scapegoat. He says, no, look at you. He's a righteous guy. Then whenever you say that to the Sitra Achra, he's out of there. He wants to go see who we're talking about and cause all kinds of problems and see the person's weaknesses. So he's off to deal with Eov. In the meantime, by dealing with Eov, God splits the sea, and the Jewish people go across, and they're saved. And by the time the Sitra Achra comes back, he goes, another fast one. Again, you've done this to me, right? I can't trust you for a moment. You're always doing something behind my back. The Sitra Achra says to God. In the meantime, Eov suffers the entire time. So a person would say, but that's not fair. How's that fair? That Eov should suffer just to save the Jewish people. So the answer is because God works midah keneged midah, measure for measure. And since Eov had the opportunity to be the deciding vote, even if Paro hadn't listened to Eov and went against the two that said save them, at least Eov had done his job. He would have done the right thing, and that's all that counts. So he could have been that. He wasn't that. So measure for measure, by the sea, he becomes the vehicle to be able to save the Jewish people. That's what it says at that time. So it looks like there's no din taking place. It looks like there's no judgment taking place. But the reality is there is. God's actually fixing the situation. He's fixing Eov. He's fixing what went wrong back at the beginning. It's all coming together at one moment. So it looks like Eva's innocent gets so down the future, from history, from what actually took place, and the Jewish people being saved. It looks like there's a scapegoat, and the Sitra Achra is being, sent after him like a dog, seeking after a person. It looks all unfair, but no, right down to the last detail, it's midah keneged midah. And midah keneged midah doesn't always mean that God's saying, you sinned, and I'm going to punish you now. And that's why the person died prematurely or old, whatever. No. Midah keneged midah means that God is devoted to our rectification. He's not interested in punishing us, certainly not for the sake of punishment. He's interested in getting us to the world to come. He's interested in us rectifying what's ever missing in our lives so we can be perfected, so that we can join him in the world to come and be one with him. He wants the best for all of us. He says, we say this in Slichos, he would rather see the sinner do tshuva than destroy him. That's what God says. Even though this guy's so bad, but I'd still rather see him do tshuva, like Menashe, who turned the whole country to Avodah Zarah for 2 decades and does tshuva at the end of his life. I'd rather see that, says God. Midah keneged midah means that God wants it to be that in the end of the day, that we have become what we have to become, and completely fulfill ourselves in the ultimate sense of the term. That's what it means, and that's why Rabbi Kiva, he died b'simcha. He died b'simcha. He died at the hands of the Romans. They tore his flesh off his body, and even his Talmidim, his loyal Talmidim, are also, they're such great rabbis, and they know the rules and all that, but they're so impressed by their Rebbe's ability to be able to take the suffering and be joyous about it. It didn't mean he wasn't suffering. It means that he was so happy to get to a point where he was paying his dues on the way out. I mean, talk about punishment. I mean, that looks so punishing. And he was doing it, by the way, teaching Torah in public, being self-sacrificing for God, and still God has this thing happen. But he's happy. You know why? Because it means that whatever he's able to go through in this world, he's able to be clear of it in the next world. And that's all that counts to him in the end. And that's why it's also Hilchos Smechot. Because if a person has to understand, we have halachas to mourn, we grieve, and it's healthy and it's important, and maybe people will need therapy and whatever, but you have to do all that, right? But you also have to understand at the end of the day, you'll see that whatever seems like a tragedy now, whatever seems difficult to grasp now, you have to believe, like Nachum did, and Eov learned, and Aaron understood, and Avraham lived, that it's all God trying to make good on all of us and all of creation. And that's Nechama. That's Nechama. Anyhow, we should not have to learn those lessons the hard way. We should be spared those things when Mashiach should come as Rosh Hashanah already, and we've gone through a lot already, and hopefully, God willing, that whatever else we need to learn, we can do it this way, in a shir and through Sfarim, and not through actual experience, not be tested that way.
Amen. Thank you very much, Rabbi. Listen, if you want to say a few things about your upcoming webinar or seminar you're putting together, do you want to mention that yet? You're not yet. You're not yet?
Not yet. Not yet.
Okay, Rabbi, have a wonderful Shabbat. Everybody have a great Shabbos, good Shabbat. We should all be safe and healthy, and our soldiers should finish the job, do what they need to do to eliminate the evil from this world. They're very enthusiastic no matter what they're going through. Talking about grief, I just want you to know that I have been very involved with soldiers on all kinds of levels. And when they get out of Gaza for the first time in 3 months, the first thing they do is say, I can't wait to get back in there and just finish the job. And they have amazing attitude and just the ability to just love this country and love God so much. Even the non-religious are really finding that this is what's happening. And we should release our hostages. We should all be no more sadness, no more grief. God willing. Thank you, Rabbi. Good night, everybody.